to introduce Kathleen McAuliffe to you all. I am reading from her book, This Is Your Brain on Parasites, which is right here. As you can see, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've got tabs all through the book. She's the author of a widely read 2012 Atlantic feature, How Your Cat is Making You Crazy. Her work has appeared in the Best American Science and Nature Writing and more than a dozen national magazines, including Discover, the New York Times Magazine, and Smithsonian. As you see, she lives here in Miami. She is currently teaching a course at the University of Miami on the microbiome. So I'm going to hand it off to her and move to the screen where she will be sharing her PowerPoint with you. So I'm going to move this out of the way. You should be seeing a gray screen right now. And you should now be seeing the front cover of Kathleen's book. And I'm going to switch places with her and hand her the microphone. Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight, Kathleen. Just a sec. Okay, we're set. Here you go.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you. I hope you have all had your dinner because this is a thoroughly disgusting subject, needless to say, but I hope you will find this talk not only squirm-inducing, but also awe-inspiring. Before we begin, I first want to address this question. Just a second, I'm trying to click this and it's not. Sorry about that. I wanted to address this question. What is a parasite? That's because even a lot of scientists sometimes mean slightly different things when they use this term. For the purpose of tonight's discussion, a parasite includes viruses, certain pathogenic bacteria, and the kinds of creatures almost all of us think of as parasites, like tapeworms, lice, mites, and the like. And the ones that I'm going to be focusing on for the first part of my talk have an awesome hidden talent. They are masters of mind control. So what do I mean by that? Let's begin with an example. This cat looks just like my own cat, Pixie, who's also a very good ratter. And I used to be very impressed with Pixie's hunting prowess, but that was before I knew that Pixie was getting a lot of help from a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. It's a single-celled protozoan, and it invades the brains of rodents, and it turns their innate fear of cats into an attraction. And when I say attraction, I mean sexual attraction. The rodents actually become sexually excited by the scent of cat owner. This is called, not surprisingly, fatal baleen attraction. By the way, this is not only convenient for the cat, but also the parasite. For the cat gut is the only place the parasite can sexually reproduce. The cat sheds the parasite's eggs in its feces. A foraging rodent picks them up from the ground and then soon ends up in the belly of a cat, completing, to quote the Lion King, the circle of life or death, depending on your perspective. So how does it pull off this feat? It has so many tricks that I could be here for another hour just telling you about them, but I'll just tell you about a few of them. It travels to the brain and every neuron it invades, it causes to produce more of a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which regulates how much risk an animal will take in order to get a reward, like, for example, sex. It travels to the testicles and cranks up their production of testosterone in females by means that have yet to be determined. It increases the amount of progesterone they produce. And rodents jacked up on sex hormones are inclined to behave in a rather cocky, foolhardy way, which is not a good thing around cats. And this cascade, this hormonal cascade, actually ultimately changes how a part of the brain, the part of the olfactory cortex, responds to the scent of cat odor, because what happens is the hormones cause what are known as, I'm sorry, we just got punted offline or off the screen. Just a moment. Hopefully we will be back with you shortly. So I was mentioning this hormonal cascade, and it changes how the olfactory cortex functions. And it does this by actually changing how certain cells in the olfactory, the genes in cells in the olfactory cortex act. And this is what's better known to many people as an epigenetic change. But as a result of it, the rodent is inclined, an infected rodent is inclined to mistake the sense of cat odor for a potential mate. So the poor male approaches, eagerly anticipating a sexual rendezvous, only to discover, yikes, I'm courting a cat.
This one.
Okay.
Go with that one. That left one.
Okay. This is a robo-crab. I call it a robo-crab because what you're looking at really is a crab that is being piloted by a parasitic barnacle called Saculina. Suspend any preconceived notions you have about barnacles. This one does not have a shell, nor does it attach itself to piers or seaweed or the sides of ships. During its free living stage, it frolics about in the sea until alighted by following scent. It alights on a crab, and then it will inject a tiny clump of its cells into the crab. And these cells then rapidly divide into a dense tangle of roots, wrapping around it all of its organs. And ultimately, it actually neuters the crab. And where the crab would normally grow a brood pouch on its underside to harbor its young, the parasitic barnacle produces a brood pouch of its own, that yellow bladder-shaped organ. And henceforth, the crab basically lives only to feed and care for the parasite's young. And then when they're ready to be born, the crab will migrate into deep waters and bob up and down, releasing them in great pulses while stirring the water with its claws to send them on their way so that they can commandeer the minds and bodies of more crabs. Incidentally, robo-crabs are exceedingly common. About 15% of crabs in some Danish fjords are robo-crabs. Half of crabs in Hawaii are robo-crabs, 75% in the Chesapeake Bay, 75% of blue crabs in the Chesapeake Bay. And in some parts of the Mediterranean, 100% of crabs will be infected if they live long enough. This is one of my favorite parasitic manipulations. A parasitic wasp grabs hold of a spider, and then it lays its egg. It attaches its egg. It's that white glistening blob that I'm pointing to right now. It lays its egg on the spider's abdomen. And as the egg grows, it grows into a larva. It starts sucking out nutrients while pumping in chemicals that cause an orb spider to radically change its web design. In the middle, you're seeing, its classic trademark circular motif. But on the far right, you can see a very different looking web. So basically, what the spider is doing is it is making a nursery for the parasites, wasp, the wasp's larva. And the larva actually can, once the spider's finished building this nursery, the larva then injects it with a poison and kills it. And the larva has little tiny legs that will actually climb up and attach itself to the web. Some parasites don't just manipulate the behavior of a host, they change their appearance too. This is a horn snail. Notice how delicate its eye stalks are. This is a parasite this is a horn snail that has been parasitized by the flatworm Leucochloridium. The parasite replicates in the digestive tract of birds, which excrete its eggs in their droppings. A snail dining on bird poop, one of their favorite treats, will swallow the eggs, which hatch inside the body and grow into worms that invade the snail's brain and tunnel into its eye stalks, stretching the walls so thin that you can actually see the parasite within. These pulsating bands, by the way, are actually brood pouches filled with the parasite's young. As this dramatic transformation is taking place, the infected snails abandon their normal nocturnal existence and become active during the day. When I say active, I mean very, very active. Some infected snails have been clocked moving about 3 feet in 15 minutes, which is an Olympian speed for a snail. And instead of staying hidden under leaves and ground cover, they ascend vegetation, climbing to the very top and positioning themselves on high up leaves where they're in plain view of songbirds, which likely mistake those pulsating eye stalks for caterpillar grubs, and they swoop down, peck on them, get a beak full of the parasites, and so the parasite completes its life cycle. This is another example of a parasite that changes the behavior and appearance of its host. On the left, you're seeing a brine shrimp that is uninfected. It's a normal brine shrimp. As you can see, it's typically translucent. But once it becomes infected with the tapeworm, it turns bright pink. And then possibly by tricking the shrimp into thinking that it's time to breed, it causes the infected shrimp to gather together with other infected shrimp so they can form these big red clouds in the water, sometimes as much as a meter or so across. Flamingos, as it turns out, are the parasite's next host, so they need only dip their ladle-shaped beaks in the water to enjoy, the rich seafood broth at their feet. One of the things that's interesting about this is it kind of gets you thinking about animals traveling in large packs, shoals, or flocks. They're assumed to do so for their own benefit, for example, to find mates, deter predators, or to enhance foraging strategies. But the scientists who identified this manipulation, Nicholas Rode and Eva Levien, think it's time to reevaluate that assumption, perhaps far more often than we realize, they say. Parasites may be herding their current host straight into the mouth of their next host. This is a killifish, one of the most abundant fish found in freshwater estuaries in Southern California. They're normally very cautious, anxious creatures that stay deep beneath the waves, but when they become infected with a parasitic worm that travels to their brains, they lose their normal fear. And likely the reason this is happening is because the parasitic worm is producing chemicals that act on the same brain circuits as Prozac. So basically, fish are less anxious. They're mellow. They're like a fish on Prozac. So they rise to the surface, flip over on their bellies, and have these white underbellies that really stand out. And they all but wave their fins at predatory birds overhead, which then swoop down and pick them out of the water. And so the parasite goes round and round. In field trials, field studies, the birds appear to be feeding almost exclusively on infected fish. These are what scientists call zombie ants. While walking on the ground, they have picked up the spores of a fungus called Ophicordyceps. And there's nothing docile about these spores. They attach to the ant's body and then quickly burrow into it and grow into its brain. And as this is happening, the ant's behavior changes, and in a very precise and predictable way. They go to the nearest sapling, and at exactly solar noon, they travel 1 foot above the ground. And then they go to the northwestern quadrant of the plant, clamp onto the main vein of the leaf, and then out of the ant's head sprouts this fungus. I have to say this completely grosses me out, this particular parasitic manipulation. Anyway, this pod then appears at the end of the stalk. It's a fruiting body, which explodes, raining spores down on more ants below, creating armies of zombie ants. They are more common than you might suspect. In many rainforests around the world, you'll find as many as 22 of their grisly corpses per square yard. You may notice a repeating theme here, namely, predators may be going after low-hanging fruit brought within their reach courtesy of parasites. After all, why work hard for a meal if it will come to you, right? Now, no discussion of parasitic manipulation would be complete without talking about rabies. The virus is quite unique in that it does not invade the bloodstream, but rather it enters through a wound, a bite wound, and follows nerve tracts to the brain, often moving at a very plodding pace. So if you get bit on your foot, for example, take a lot longer to develop rabies than if you get bitten on your hand. It's a shorter distance to travel. Once it gets into the brain, it infects an area that controls fundamental drives like aggression, hunger, and sex. These are typical symptoms of rabies in people. I think most of you probably know about them. Foaming at the mouth, flying into a rage, terrifying hallucinations, heightened sensitivity to light and noise. People with rabies are kind of like people with terrible migraines. They find any kind of light or the least noise deeply upsetting. And here's a strange one, hypersexuality. This is an uncommon but well-documented symptom of rabies in people. In fact, the French called rabies le fureur utérine and la rage amoureuse. I share this lurid aspect of rabies with you because it is almost certainly the inspiration for vampire and werewolf legends, many of which derive from Eastern Europe in the 18th century. According to folklore, vampires are people, including the recently deceased, who rise at night and, assuming the form of a dog, rape or ravage their neighbors. In subsequent retellings, the dog was changed to a bat, another common vector for transmitting rabies, of course. Like rabies victims, vampires are very sensitive to light, hence their nocturnal habits. And of course, they suffer from a contagious madness transmissible by a bite. Also, it's noteworthy that the lifespan of a vampire is 40 days, which happens to be the typical amount of time a person will live after being bitten by a rabid animal. We may be accidental hosts for other parasites as well. Remember Toxoplasma gondii, the parasite that turns rodents into reckless romantics. You may be surprised to hear that about 20% of people have the parasite in their brains. Most, of course, completely unaware of the fact. One of several ways that we can be exposed is by changing a cat litter box. According to standard medical wisdom, toxoplasma mainly poses a threat to fetuses or immune-compromised patients whose nervous systems it can damage. In people with a healthy immune system, however, the parasite has long been thought to be harmless, typically causing brief flu-like symptoms before hunkering down inside nerve cells, never to again to cause any further problems. Several scientific groups, for example, at Oxford, Johns Hopkins University, and at Stanford are now questioning that view. They think that in probably a very small percent of infected people, the so-called dormant infection actually can cause problems. One of the reasons that I think this is because of a lot of different epidemiological research. So, for example, people who have schizophrenia, there was a study of an overview analysis of 38 high quality studies in the scientific literature. And it found that people with schizophrenia are 2 to 3 times more likely on average to test positive for toxoplasma. The dormant infection also correlates with higher incidence of bipolar disorder and suicidal behavior. In one study that was done across 22 countries in Europe, the researchers found that the incidence of suicidal behavior increased in direct proportion to the prevalence of the parasite in each country. And the parasite has also, studies done in several countries suggests that the parasite may also be associated with reckless driving. People who test positive for the parasite are more likely to be in car crashes where they're the party at fault. So who knows, perhaps the parasite is also, just as it makes rodents behave in a more reckless, foolhardy manner, perhaps it has the same effect on us when we're behind the wheel of a car. I would like to underscore, though, that you know, it's obviously only a tiny percent of people who are infected who suffer these adverse consequences. Nobody knows how many, but it's probably a very small percent. And when you consider that 20% of people in the US are infected, and then you look at schizophrenia, well, only 1% of the population has schizophrenia, and the parasites probably only might be involved, and I say might, we don't know for sure, but might be involved in only, a small percentage of those cases. So what else might be manipulating our behavior? One possibility is microbes that are everyday residents of our bodies. They outnumber our own cells. They're slightly more than half of you is not you. It's microbes, many of which live in your gut. And even though we don't think of these microbes as parasites, many might more aptly be called symbionts. They have a profound impact on how we think and feel and act. I include them in my book because they could have stolen a page straight out of the playbook of parasitic manipulators. Indeed, many of them use exactly the same tricks to alter the behavior of their host. These bacteria produce virtually every single neurotransmitter found in your brain. And they also produce hormones, and they break down the foods that we eat into neuroactive metabolites to varying degrees. Scientists think that gut bacteria influence whether we're happy or sad, anxious or calm, energetic or sluggish, and by regulating our appetite, perhaps even whether we're fat or thin. Animal studies certainly suggest our microbiota has far-reaching effects on our behavior. A mouse with its normal complement of gut bacteria is normally a very quick learner, has good memory, it's inquisitive, it's fearful of predators, and when young, it will cling to its mother to stay safe. But rodents that are raised under sterile conditions so that they lack gut bacteria couldn't be more different. They're like positively weird. They're slow to learn, quick to forget. They are stunningly devoid of fear, wide open spaces and brightly lit areas that scream danger to the normal rodent, don't deter them in the least. They don't even show signs of distress when separated from their mothers when they're still very young. But if you colonize them with the normal bacteria for that strain of mouse, their behavior completely normalizes. You have to do that, though, when they're still young. If you wait till later, they remain permanently abnormal. As one microbiome researcher, Stephen Collins, put it, you could say that it's in the best interest, that it's in the bacteria's best interest that the host survives and takes fewer risks. As we've seen, parasites often strive to manipulate the behavior of animals for their own gain. But animals can outwit them with their own behavior. By that I mean that they react to high-risk situations in stereotypical ways that protect them from infection. This is the focus of the second half of my book, and I devote so much space to these behavioral defenses because they are arguably as important as our immune system in keeping us safe from disease. Simple examples of behavioral defenses are not drinking murky green water, shunning feces. Large cats and wolves will never soil their own dens. One of the reasons we find it so easy to house train their domesticated relatives. Cattle, sheep, and horses will never graze near fresh dung heaps, no matter how lush the grass is in their vicinity. Jane Goodall spoke of chimps as having an almost instinctive horror of being soiled by excrement. In fact, she actually tells a funny story about a female chimp that raised her rump to signal her interest in sex. And the male initially seemed game until he saw that she had a diarrheal smear on her fur, whereupon he decided to abstain. And another chimp eventually did take her up on her offer, but not before first meticulously cleaning off the offensive spot with leaves. The beauty of behavioral defenses is that they typically protect against not one parasite, but hordes of them. That gives us a critical advantage. Why? Parasites have fast replication rates, so they can readily acquire new mutations and enable them to overcome a host defenses. But hosts like ourselves have far too slow replication rates, so we need a better shield. And behavioral defenses are that shield. This baboon is demonstrating, another behavioral defense. It's licking its wound. Saliva is rich in antimicrobial properties that make it very good for sterilizing wounds. Felines, canines, rodents, and primates all engage in this behavior. Scientists suspect early humans likely did too, and humans, modern humans probably continue this tradition, but probably unknowingly. Grooming is certainly an obvious behavioral defense against parasites, but I think that we often don't appreciate just how important grooming really is in nature. Take rodents, if they're prevented from grooming, they have 60 times more lice. Not surprisingly, rodents spend about 1/3 of their waking hours grooming. Impalas are very delicate creatures, so a single engorged tick can weaken these fast sprinters and make them easy targets for predators. With the cost of an infection so steep, impalas take great pains to systematically scrape clean the path that ticks normally take when they move from the ground to animal's head or rear, where they're out of the animal's reach. They use their teeth as combs, and they groom themselves every 10 or 15 minutes in this fashion, whether or not they have ticks. Scientists call this program grooming because it's as if the animal has a clock in its head that tells it to groom. They also engage in reciprocal grooming. One impala will go straight up to the other one and start scraping its head, like about 10 or 11 times. And if the other impala does not immediately reciprocate, it will go somewhere else. This too is programmed. And of course, reciprocal grooming is common throughout nature. Another defense against parasites is eating bitter substances, hence the expression, a bitter pill to swallow. What's so curative about bitter substances? They're markers for toxicity. So if you consume a little of them, you kill parasites without hopefully killing the patient in the bargain. Many of the medicines of native healers are bitter. In fact, sometimes they equate the potency of remedy with its bitterness. And as it turns out, a large number of the medicines sold, in pharmacies are also similarly bitter. The better to kill parasites. And even though we normally shun bitter things, since antiquity, we have endured these awful medicines, but only when sick. Chimps are similar to us. When they are sick or show signs of diarrhea, primatologists have observed them take long detours from their normal path, their normal routes through forests, and set off in search of a very bitter plant called Vernonia. And in fact, it's in some African dialects, it's called sheep killer. It's that toxic. The chimp will break off a shoot and peel it back to expose its bitter pith, and then just take tiny, take a few sips, just suck a teeny bit, and that's it. Other chimps may watch, but they won't partake. Once a baby chimp actually tried to pick up a discarded pith, and the mother chimp put her foot on it and carted the little one away. Eating clay is another behavioral defense. This is a woman in a clay pit. Most clay is very light in color, as you can see in these pictures. It tends to be sort of a pale orange or yellow, or even on the white side. It's actually sold in markets in many parts of Africa. You can see in the upper left-hand corner. It's sold as a treatment for belly aches and diarrhea. And hordes of animals also consume clay, and the likely reason is because clay has its chemical structure can easily bond to any kind of toxin. And as we know, many parasites churn out sloughs of toxins. So the clay grabs hold of the toxins, and then they get whisked out in our waste. The fine, slippery structure of clay also coats the mucosal lining, reinforcing that barrier. So that also prevents amoebas and larger parasites from, finding their way into the gut. Animals probably eat clay in part because it protects against infectious disease, but in the case of many herbivores, eating clay allows them to consume many foods that would otherwise be too toxic for them to safely obtain nutrients from. Our behavioral immune system, what is that? Humans possess the most advanced behavioral defense system of any creature on Earth. Our ability to detect and dodge parasites without any help from modern medicine is truly amazing. Can you guess what it is? Of course, you can't answer me, but here's a clue if you're wondering. It's an emotion. Know what I'm talking about now? Disgust. Disgust was called the forgotten emotion of the 20th century. That's because it utterly confused scientists. So they just decided to ignore it. And it confused them because, they just couldn't figure out what the purpose of disgust was. And part of their confusion was due to the fact, to quote infectious disease expert Valerie Curtis, a weird mixed grab bag of dirty, slimy, sticky, stinking, wriggly things disgust us. Now, some of these things are easy to link to disease, for example, rancid meat, curdled milk, and vomit. But in other cases, the connection is not so obvious. So take rats, cockroaches, snails, seaweed. None of these are parasites, so why do they disgust us? Well, Curtis and others theorize that probably the likely reason in the case of rodents is because they often transmit lots of nasty viral infections. Cockroaches transmit a bunch of gastrointestinal bugs. Snails are slimy, a common marker of parasites. They're also likely to transmit a number of parasitic worms. Seaweed is similarly slimy, and this was a surprise to me. It can transmit cholera. Earthworms disgust a lot of people, but they're completely harmless. They're great for our gardens, but they're harmless. They can't hurt us. So why are we repelled by them? Probably the reason is because they resemble the parasitic worms in fish and meat, which, if we accidentally swallow, will burrow into our intestines, and lots of nasty things will happen to us. Here's a really weird disgust elicitor. Clusters of little holes. Okay, so why would clusters of little holes repel people? By the way, so many people are repelled by clusters of little holes that this aversion actually has a name, tryptophobia. So the leading theory as to what makes some people just shudder in horror at the sight of little holes, and typically they're in a honeycomb pattern, it's because they may resemble the pattern of insect eggs laid in flesh or fur. If you didn't have a case of tryptophobia, maybe I've just given you one. So are we predisposed to be disgusted by certain things, or do we learn our disgust from our life's experiences? I think it's really useful to think of disgust like the human sex drive. So individuals vary in the strength of their libidos and what sexually excites them. And this drive and how it's manifested changes over one's lifespan and can be altered by unique life experiences and societal values. So it is with disgust. The emotion does not operate in a vacuum. Clearly, it can be influenced by other drives. Hunger is a famous flavor enhancer. So if you live in a part of the world where food is scarce, say close to the Arctic Circle, then even dried strips of putrefied shark meat may taste good to you. Icelanders call this treat harkar. We usually don't know why certain foods that are reviled by most cultures are embraced by a few, but in this case, we do. Prior to 1975, no Cambodian would dream of sitting down to a plate full of tarantulas. So what happened at that time that led to the dramatic shift in culinary preferences? It turns out it was drastic food shortages caused by the brutal Khmer Rouge regime. In desperation, Cambodians started tossing tarantulas into their woks and were surprised by their tasty crunchiness, and so was born a new culinary tradition. Anyone who's well-traveled certainly knows that what delights one man delights someone in one part of the world, disgusts another. So what's going on here? If there's a rule to explain such varied tastes, it seems to be this: you are predisposed to prefer your own culture's foods because in the past, it favored survival in the local habitat with its own unique group of edible plants and animals and safe methods to prepare them. So if there's kind of a biological rule, it's, when in doubt, stick with mama's cooking. Lust depresses disgust. If some random person stuck their tongue in your ear, you would likely be horrified. But with somebody that you thought was super hot, you might react very differently. It's really very fortunate that that lust suppresses disgust because bodily fluids are, very powerful disgust elicitors. So, snot, blood, urine, saliva, semen, all repulse us unless we're sexually aroused. So this is very fortunate, or our race would long ago have gone extinct. Incidentally, a lot of people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, which in half of cases takes the form of germophobia, they're often virgins or very, very rarely have sex. And that's probably related to high levels of disgust. One of the interesting things about our behavioral immune system is that it's kind of poorly calibrated. So humans are leading sources of infection. So our behavioral immune system pays close attention to other people, but anything that registers as abnormal, contagious or not, can trigger disgust. So a runny nose, festering skin sore, acne, even obesity. Obesity may perhaps be there's mistaken for. Sorry, there's a disease called elephantiasis, also known as filariasis. It's a technical name. That at one time used to be very common on several continents. So that may be part of the reason obesity can repel us. If people are squeamish by temperament, or if they're prompted to think about germs, they're also more likely to feel repelled by people they perceive to be of a different race or ethnicity. Scientists speculate that this may be a behavioral adaptation or a prejudice rooted in history. Especially in centuries past, foreigners were more likely to carry germs for which we have for which local populations had no defenses. And when our disgust levels are elevated, we're also more likely to be intolerant of people who buck convention. Researchers theorize that this is because many traditions have the hidden purpose of shielding us from infection. For example, sexual taboos, marrying only within your religious group, obviously culinary practices, washing before prayer, bowing instead of handshaking, reserving the left hand only for bathroom functions. And if you were a Muslim or Hindu, handing somebody a piece of fruit with your left hand would be a grave offense. So to recap, high levels of disgust correlate with sexually conservative values, being wary of mingling with foreigners. So, for example, being opposed to immigration, a reverence for traditions, an intolerance of those who break societal taboos. For example, being hard on crime. If you look at this list, you might think, hey, maybe conservatives are more disgust sensitive. And in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that may indeed be the case. Here are two powerful tools for studying how disgust impacts our social values. A typical experimental approach is to secretly release a foul odor when people are being asked to make judgments about morally dubious behavior. Telling a white lie, cheating, gossiping, unethical journalism, marriage between first cousins, all become more reprehensible when subjects breathed in foul air. When people are filling out questionnaires tapping their views on hot-button political issues like immigration and school prayer, a revolting odor shifts political attitudes to the right on average. When shown stomach churning imagery, at the beginning you may have seen that picture of a man swallowing worms. That was one of the pictures used in this study. Conservatives sweat more profusely than liberals, as measured by galvanic skin responses. You can see in the top photo. And then compared to liberals, conservatives display greater brain activity in response to being shown unflushed toilets, rotting corpses, and other disgusting imagery as they're lying in an MRI scanner. They show these pictures. Another way that scientists measure disgust is with disgust inventories. It's kind of a crude method. You're asked to rank how revolted you'd be, how revolted you'd feel if you, for example, had some gross experience, like you stepped in dog poop, or you've been into an apple with a worm in it, or you found a cockroach in your soup. The less precise and other methods, disgust inventories offer the advantage of allowing scientists to conduct massive online surveys. For example, of the relationship between germophobia and xenophobia. In one such study led by Danish political scientists Michael Bang-Petersen and Lenny Rowe, a representative sample of roughly 2,000 Danes and 1,300 Americans took an online test that ranked their sensitivity to disgust, and then their attitudes towards allowing foreigners into their respective countries was assessed. After controlling for every variable that the scientists could think of, race, age, gender, education, socioeconomic factors, you name it, the scientists found that opposition to immigration increased in direct proportion to individuals' disgust sensitivity in both samples. A habit of fretting about germs may even predict voting behavior. A Cornell University team led by psychologists David Pizarro and Yoel Inbar conducted an online disgust sensitivity survey of 25,000 Americans during the 2008 US presidential election. Respondents with the highest contagion anxiety scores were the most likely to indicate that they would vote for Republican nominee Senator John McCain, who was a more conservative candidate, over Democrat Barack Obama. Moreover, a state's average level of disgust sensitivity actually predicted the proportion of votes cast for McCain. The Cornell team went on to show that disgust sensitivity similarly tracked with political beliefs in 122 other countries, basically wherever a nation's response rate was high enough to obtain statistically meaningful results. I should say that all of this research, especially the relationship between disgust and political ideology, this is a fast developing field. It's certainly early days. I wouldn't be surprised if as more data becomes available, many theories are going to have to be revised or discarded altogether. I mean, it's certainly a controversial topic, as you can imagine, in the polarized world that we currently live in. But I think clearly enough data is available at this time that we can say with confidence that parasites clearly have far-reaching and unexpected, often unexpected influences on our behavior, which makes you wonder, just who's in charge of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, and I'd now be happy to take questions.
Stop sharing here. How do I do that? Oops. Hold on, everybody. Technical. Alrighty.
Close this.
Yeah, but I gotta get to. Never had this problem before. I should just be able to click this thing and stop sharing. Well, actually, the mouse isn't working at all. Oh boy.
You want to sit down for a moment?
No, it's okay. I don't know what. It's very strange. I should be able to just click on here and get the heck out of that's Kenny. Oh, he's got a question for you. Want to answer that while I work on this?
Where in the brain is the area that makes the mice sexually attracted to a cat? That's a part. Can everybody hear me, do you think?
I'm hoping.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I will answer that question with the hope that you can. It is a part of the olfactory cortex that is, he says, I'm a little quiet. Maybe I should turn the volume up.
There you go. I just turned it up.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
It is a part of an olfactory cortex. And as it turns out, the part of the brain that processes the scent of cat urine actually happens to be very close to the part of the brain that normally, sorry, I'm hearing a really bad echo. Just one moment.
You're hearing an echo?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There's all the questions.
So these, oh boy, terrible echo.
Yeah.
Just one moment.
I know why. Now it's gone.
Okay, let's hope for the best.
Yeah. Echo's gone.
Oh, the echo's gone. Okay, so where was I? Oh yeah, so the part of the brain that normally processes scents like cat urine is right next to the part of the brain that normally processes scents associated with a a sexual mate. And when there's an excess of testosterone going to the brain, it causes a kind of leakiness across these two brain areas, and that's what causes the confusion. So that when the rodent catches a whiff of cat urine, it gets a little confused, doesn't know whether to approach or run for its life.
This is a good question, Kathleen. Paxton Culpepper wants to know, well, thank you for the talk. And are all the studies you've discussed cited in your book?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
all of them.
Here we have a Hindu himself who says, as a Hindu, eating with the left hand also triggers disgust. You must have written that before you mentioned it.
Yes, quite likely.
How did you get the idea to write the book, and what did the publishers think when you pitched the idea?
Okay, I got the idea to write the book when I came across some articles in the scientific literature about the cat parasite. And when I found out that it could actually, make rodents sexually attracted to cats, I thought this is the weirdest thing I've ever heard of in my life. Um, and then I did more reading and was stunned to discover that lots of people are infected, and that some scientists actually thought that it might be changing our behavior too. So, and from then on, I just kind of started to become fascinated by all things parasitic. I was surprised to learn that this cat parasite was by no means unique in nature, that in fact there's lots of parasitic manipulators out there. In fact, many of them manipulate keystone species. So they have, really huge environmental impact.
How about Sarah Kotler's question? Can you still eat the blue crabs that are infected in the Chesapeake?
No, it wouldn't be a good idea. The good news is that the fishermen always toss infected crabs, because it's so easy to see that pouch on the underside of the crab, the parasite's pouch. Also, infected crabs tend to look very mangy, because once they become infected, they can no longer molt. So they become, covered in barnacles. I mean, your run-of-the-mill barnacle, and they kind of, you'll see seaweed stuck to them and things like that, and that's usually a sign that they're infected.
Indira Cummings asks, can these microbes inside of us be able to survive without us?
Most most cannot. For example, a lot are anaerobic, and they're extremely hard to culture outside the body. And it wasn't until gene sequencing technology became significantly advanced in sort of the mid 2000s that scientists could figure out what was going inside us by basically looking at the genetic code.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead, everybody, and move us back to the lobby area where you can click on this link here and you could purchase a copy of Kathleen's book or visit her website. And I'm going to ask Kathleen just to stick around a little longer. If any of you have any questions, you could go ahead. I'm going to clear this. And you could go ahead and type your questions right where I'm typing, right here. And that would conclude our webinar today. I want to thank our guest speaker, Kathleen McAuliffe, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And if any of you would like to say anything else, I see some people are indeed typing. She'll stick around for a little bit longer. Okay, so I'm going to leave it to her and you guys, and and I understand if you guys start clearing out as well. We got a couple typers. There you go. Thank you. Read it out loud in case they can't.
Yes.
No, read the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Does the parasites in the shrimp affect the birds that eat them? And the answer is yes, but probably it doesn't have that much impact on them, but they may be a little bit, a little bit less healthy than otherwise, but it doesn't cause much damage. It doesn't take much of a toll on the animal.
We see that multiple attendees are typing, so we're just going to hang in a little longer. You're popular, Kathleen.
In reference to the brine shrimp, are the transparent shrimp infected, or is it the reddish one that is? It is the reddish shrimp that is infected. The brine shrimp are normally translucent, but it's the infected shrimp that turn bright pink. We're waiting as more people are typing away. Are there any other ways for humans to contract Toxoplasma gondii other than coming in contact with cat feces in a litter box? I'm glad you asked that question because, in fact, there are many ways you can be exposed to Toxoplasma, and changing cat litter boxes may not even be the most common route. One common way that kids can be exposed is while playing in sandboxes because, of course, they're favorite places for cats to bury their feces. So whenever sandboxes are not in use, you should keep them covered. If you are out gardening and you don't wash your hands thoroughly afterwards, or if you're harvesting vegetables from your garden and you don't thoroughly scrub them, so dirt particles may still be clinging to your fruits and vegetables, you can be exposed by that route. And also, sounds a little weird, but eating rare meat it can expose you to the parasite because, just as foraging rodents can pick up the parasite from the ground, so too can grazing cattle, and it becomes incorporated in their flesh, the meat that we eat. And in France, a place where they love their meat, saignant, literally bleeding, about half of people are infected with Toxoplasma gondii. If you like your meat rare, I recommend that you freeze it first before cooking because that will kill the parasite. Okay, someone else said, I was confused because in the PowerPoint presentation, it says that transparent ones are the infected ones.
I think she's referring to the shrimp.
Oh, I'll have to check that afterwards, but if that's the case, I apologize. Has there ever been a documented human born into a sterile environment without gut bacteria? And if so, were their actions documented as well? I don't know of any such case, no. Let's see, my students will love this discussion. I had a few questions if this was the origin of many religious traditions, such as pork, shellfish, and such. What are your thoughts? I do think that many religions, many religious traditions have the hidden function of protecting us from parasitic infection. Judaism, which of course is the foundation for both Christianity and Islam, is certainly, the Torah is filled with all kinds of injunctions that serve to protect us from infection. In fact, Judaism arose just as at the dawn of agriculture, when people were, settling down, typically at river deltas and planting crops, and so people were living in close, increasingly densely populated pockets of the world, and they were domesticating animals, so they were living in close proximity to animals. So they were being exposed to animal pathogens, and of course, wherever you have a lot of people and humans, you've got a lot of excrement, contaminating water. So Judaism arose, and for that matter, Hinduism too, but arose as infectious disease was exploding in society. And if you look more closely at Judaism, you'll see just no end of injunctions relate to protecting us from infectious disease, starting with Jewish priests were instructed to wash their hands, Jewish priests being the healers in their society. The Jews were instructed to bathe on the Sabbath every Saturday. They were told to cover their wells, a good way to keep out vermin. They were encouraged to wash their eating utensils. Sorry, not wash, but to put used eating utensils into boiling water, basically to sterilize them, to bury their dead within 3 days. And of course, in a desert environment, corpses are about to decompose after about 3 days. As there are numerous injunctions. I mean, the early Jews were told to to isolate lepers. They were among the first to quarantine lepers, and if infection continued in the community, they were told to burn their clothes. I mean, it's astonishing considering that Judaism arose many thousands of years before anybody knew the first thing about the germ theory of disease. Let me move to a new question. Is the rabies virus hydrophobic? People who have rabies become hydrophobic. Interestingly, this is a symptom of, hydrophobic, in case people don't know. Hydrophobic means fearful of water. People who have rabies become fearful of water. And no one knows exactly why people alone, no animals display this, but people alone, if they have rabies, just even the sound of water spilling in a basin or the sight of water will make people with rabies gag. Here's another question. Do scientists know how the feeling of disgust in humans formed? I think they mean probably evolved. Well, nobody can know for certain, but of course it's assumed that we first became disgusted, like on all animals, by things like feces, rancid odors, meat crawling in maggots, that kind of thing. And then in the case of humans, probably early on, we became repelled by people whose behavior exposed us to parasites. So initially, we may have been, for example, repulsed by people who had lice, and then we became repelled, by people who didn't comb their hair to get rid of the lice and so forth. So it sort of gradually switched from being repelled by people whose behavior exposes us to parasites.
And is it fair to say that those people that were not disgusted may have gotten parasites and died? Therefore, the people who did have a disgust reaction are the ones who survived and passed those disgust genes, so to speak, on to the next generation.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that point. That's a much more simple, straightforward way of putting it. Yes. The number of religions and degree of participation and commitment to the religions correlates with the level of parasite stress in the ecology. There actually is quite a bit of evidence to support that assertion, and I suspect that's from Paxton Culpepper, and I suspect he is familiar with the parasite stress theory of values and sociality. And that theory proposes that and actually there's quite a bit of evidence to support it, that people who live in parts of the world where infectious disease is most prevalent, especially, for example, around the equator, they do tend to be more religious. And again, that may be because religious traditions often protect us from parasitic infection. Okay, I think we're done. Oh, here's one more. Have you seen much of the current research on the microbiome being actively used to treat mental illness, for example, depression and anxiety? Microbiome transplants might prove to be more effective than medication. Yes. You're absolutely right. There are a number of studies underway with probiotics, and they're giving probiotics to people who suffer from disorders like depression and anxiety, and looking to see if it helps their mood. There are some preliminary trials that suggest that the approach may work, but it's very early days yet. There's also a surprising amount of research that suggests that autism spectrum disorder may actually start in the gut. Fincher and Thornhill, for those who are interested. Yes, Corey Fincher and Randy Thornhill are authors of the parasite stress theory of sociality.
Well, everybody, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.